How infrastructure shapes economies. Have you ever thought about what really makes a country's economy grow? Does it have to do with funding, new ideas, or something else? This video goes into the interesting world of infrastructure and shows how the roads we use, the energy we use, and the information networks we depend on are what make economies work. How do these invisible props affect everything, from business in your own town to trade around the world? Stay tuned to learn about the hidden power of infrastructure and how it shapes countries' prosperity. Investments in power, water, and transportation infrastructure help the economy. These things are needed by the economy, and government spending boosts GDP. Infrastructure funding by the government has a higher impact than other spending. However, its stimulation efficacy isn't always certain. Sometimes investing in transportation makes sense. Fiscal stimulus makes infrastructure projects appealing to politicians. Infrastructure spending creates enormous building sites, reminding voters that the government is fixing a problem. Despite the benefits of their final products, they are often lauded for fueling the economy. Concerned persons must study infrastructure's pros and cons before utilizing it as a stimulant because politicians may use it as a political signal. The question is not whether infrastructure expenditure improves the economy, but how well it compares to alternative fiscal stimulus measures. Politicians must weigh the pros and cons of each funding option to finish the project. Discover the best periods to invest in infrastructure as an economic stimulant. Infrastructure projects are popular fiscal stimulus because they produce tangible results that policymakers can show the public. According to research, infrastructure spending can boost the economy more than other spending. Due to practical constraints, stimulation expenditure only works under certain situations. Private sector spending yields the best economic growth from government expenditures. To maximize economic growth, infrastructure spending must be targeted, timely, and temporary. Infrastructure stimulus theory. Keynesian economics is the foundation for the notion that infrastructure spending may stimulate the economy. According to Keynesian theory, a lack of aggregate demand during a recession can cause the economy to be trapped with persistently high unemployment and a stagnating GDP for a long time. When people and companies buy less, companies lose money and fire employees, who then buy less, and so on in a self-sustaining loop. The Keynesians suggest that one way to address this is for the government to directly compensate for the absence of demand from the private sector by substituting demand from the public sector, which is funded by deficit spending. Essentially, this expenditure can be applied to anything. Milton Friedman, an economist, developed the field of monetarism after rejecting many of Keynes's views. In order to support his theory that burying money bottles in a coal mine and allowing people to excavate them would be a beneficial economic stimulus, Keynes devised the thought experiment. Although this is frequently taken too literally, the intention was to demonstrate how fiscal stimulus of any kind could help close the output gap in the economy. It would, in fact, be more reasonable to build houses and the like, as Keynes himself stated. Increased impact. A stimulus's ability to close the output gap is dependent on the multiplier effect. The idea that every dollar spent by the government generates a certain amount of additional spending in the private sector is known as the multiplier effect. As an illustration, the government employs someone to build a road. That individual then goes and spends money at a business, the owner of which uses the proceeds to hire additional employees, and so on. Where those dollars are spent will determine how much of an impact they have. The multiplier impact will be smaller if government funds are given to individuals who plan to keep them. But if government funds are given to individuals who will spend them, allowing the money to flow into the economy, the multiplier will be bigger. This can enable a fiscal stimulus to have a much greater impact on the economy than simply the amount of money the government spends, enabling the economy to emerge from recession while reducing deficit expenditure. Impact of infrastructure stimulus on the economy. Recent estimates from the Congressional Budget Office and a meta-analysis of empirical data from economic studies show that public investment spending multiplies GDP more than other forms of spending and stimulates private spending. Thus, infrastructure spending appears to be a good fiscal stimulus on paper. However, economic stimulus proponents agree on 3 criteria for stimulus expenditure, beyond the multiplier's size under ideal conditions, to reverse the effects of a negative economic shock by stimulating the economy. Infrastructure spending may have a high multiplier effect in ideal conditions, but meeting all 3 prerequisites may be difficult. In order to prevent a precipitous economic decline, stimulus spending must be introduced immediately, Programs that take months or years may not be implemented fast. Spending delays may mitigate the current economic crisis, but if they arrive too late, they may overheat the economy. Spending must be given to customers who will spend it quickly to boost the economy. This usually applies to low-income households and those hardest affected by the recession. Receivers who hoard the money or use it to pay off debt reduce the stimulus's multiplier effect, reducing spending. Only use stimulus when essential to fight a recession. If not, continuous deficit spending may discourage private investment, cause microeconomic inefficiencies, or lead to unmanageable state debt. Particular points to remember: infrastructure construction projects may take months or years to start due to implementation delays. The stimulus's total effect may not be timely. Construction investment peaks years after a project begins, often while the economy is recovering. This may result in a pro-cyclical tendency of spending less when the economy is weak and more when it is strong. This type of expenditure's multiplier effect may boost economic cycles rather than reduce them. There may be various infrastructure projects that can receive full funding during a crisis, but few. This limits the number of infrastructure stimulus projects. Infrastructure expenditure seems temporary because it is generally committed to pay specific projects, but cost overruns and other issues might delay this. One warning is that infrastructure strongly influences regional economic development. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 invests $437 billion in energy security, climate change, and ACA extension. Dangers of using economic stimulus funds for infrastructure. If infrastructure is built to boost the economy rather than improve regional economic development, it could have long-term effects. This is important because infrastructure may be created quickly without considering long-term impacts to give a stimulus on time. Infrastructure stimulus financing is further limited to established projects. Finally, allocating infrastructure spending to meet macroeconomic goals may be difficult. This spending nearly always goes into heavy construction, which may or may not suffer during a recession. Fixed capital projects like infrastructure must be relatively targeted. It's unrealistic to expect a recession's impacts to match infrastructure needs. The public need for infrastructure and economic boost may collide. Several studies have shown that political and electoral variables often have a greater impact on stimulus-related infrastructure spending than either of these two aims. Politicians and officials may find infrastructure expenditure appealing, even though it may contradict economic goals. Profiting from infrastructure investment, rushing infrastructure and neglecting planning to give stimulus quickly could harm area economies long after the crisis. Two conditions must be met for infrastructure improvements to provide a fiscal stimulus. First, the government should fund urgent projects. They should have been arranged or launched. Because ongoing projects must be in recession-stricken areas, options are limited. Second, the recession must have affected infrastructure building sectors like construction and heavy manufacturing. If not, the most needy won't be stimulated. Infrastructure spending's multiplier impact makes stimulus an effective economic growth tool. Due to these restrictions, stimulation has limited useful uses. If these issues are ignored, infrastructure spending becomes worthless or damaging for fiscal policy. The Jobs and Infrastructure Investment Act. On November 15, 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act into law. More than $500 billion will be used to repair roads and bridges, maintain the water system, roll out faster internet across the country, and other infrastructure-related projects under this $1.2 trillion measure. Furthermore, funding was made accessible for the expansion of renewable energy initiatives. Although the law included a sizable infrastructure package, it is only about half as large as Biden's initial proposal, which also contained a $1.75 trillion Build Back Better (BBB) plan aimed at addressing public health and social infrastructure. The BBB plan underwent substantial revisions and was renamed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was ratified on August 16, 2022. What does infrastructure mean? In general, infrastructure refers to the public goods that benefit local communities. These consist of utilities like gas, electricity, water, sewerage, cell phone towers, and internet connections. Transportation-related infrastructure also consists of railroads, roads, bridges, tunnels, and waterways. They are mostly financed by taxpayer money since they are public goods. How can investment in infrastructure promote economic growth? Spending on infrastructure generates jobs for those involved in project design and execution. These encompass both blue-collar and white-collar vocations. Day laborers and engineers, for instance, are both required. Since infrastructure projects frequently take months or years to finish, the jobs will remain. After that, these employees support local businesses by spending their earnings there. Furthermore, after the improvements are finished, residents will be able to use utilities and transportation more effectively, which will increase worker productivity. What became of the Better Build Back plan? On November 19, 2021, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Build Back Better Measure 220 to 213, but the U.S. Senate rejected it. Republicans and a few senators from the Democratic Party contended that the law was excessively costly and significantly enlarged the jurisdiction of the federal government. On August 16, 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act, a much weakened version of the original bill, was ratified. Public commodities like power, water, and transportation are necessary to keep a country running smoothly and to provide the basic requirements of its people. Investing in infrastructure is widely regarded as a great method to boost the economy, regardless of how each project turns out. Investing in infrastructure can boost broad macroeconomic indicators like the GDP and employment rate. However, because they take a while to begin, infrastructure projects aren't always able to offer stimulus quickly enough to aid in a recession. Spending on infrastructure works best when it addresses an existing need, is implemented on schedule, and provides funds to workers and industries that are negatively affected by recession. If you found this exploration of how infrastructure shapes economies intriguing, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay connected for more insightful content on the forces driving global development and economic success. Subscribe now and never miss an update.